This week, I want to give a shout out to Barry Walsh and Jody Smith Bennett and Cass Cruz, who are the geniuses who are doing brilliant and masterful work to pull these sessions together every week. So a big shout out to them, a big thanks to them. And I want to welcome you to Education Now, a new initiative by the Harvard Graduate School of Education to respond to the dramatic changes and disruptions in education in our lives today. In these webinars, we'll be talking honestly about these times. We hope these conversations and your questions will generate rays of light and hope, valuable insights about how to navigate this complex education landscape. And I really want to encourage you to add your insights and ideas and to submit questions. You can do that anytime throughout this conversation. Just use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. In this episode, I am thrilled to have my terrific HGSE colleague and friend, Professor Sarah Dryden-Peterson, and Ana Tavares, an elementary school superintendent with the Boston Public Schools. I'm also proud to say that they're both HGSE alumni. Sarah's work with refugee and migrant communities offers compelling global lessons in navigating change and confronting inequalities. And Ana's work on increasing learning in a bilingual setting and partnering with teachers and families offers insight to providing access to high quality public education for all students. Today's conversation is about preparing young people and ourselves to adapt to change, confront inequities, and strengthen our school communities in a time of turmoil. Please join me in welcoming Sarah and Ana. Sarah and Ana, it is wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. And Sarah, I think I want to start with you. You've done a lot of work in climates of great uncertainty with refugee and migrant communities. What are some of the lessons that you can share with us about working in those communities? Lessons that are useful to other communities in similar settings, but also lessons that are useful here in the US.
Thanks so much, Rick. I'm delighted to have this conversation today with you and with you, Ana. I think one of the real takeaways that we find in our work with refugee families is this kind of universal and optimistic belief that crisis, disruption, and uncertainty will be short-lived. And then this realization that, of course, it's not. So for refugees are displaced, for example, on average between 10 and 25 years. And I think this idea that uncertainty is not a short-term endeavor is important to the work that we're doing now and as we think about the context of this pandemic. One of the things that kind of shifts that really happens in other crisis contexts is a move from thinking about what is life-saving to what is life-sustaining. So not what keeps us alive and safe right now, but what makes it worthwhile to be alive. And education and learning, of course, are core to that life-sustaining work. But we have to ask ourselves that question of what kind of learning is life-sustaining. In the work that we've done with refugee and in communities of displacement, when we ask children and families what the purposes of education are, they are so clear that the purposes are about making a future. And when that future is uncertain, the role of education becomes even more magnified. So I think really a core principle of thriving in uncertainty requires that education doesn't anticipate a quick return to normal, but really instead prepares young people to adapt and to change, to build these kind of new futures together.
Yeah. So this is very helpful. I think it might be helpful to tell folks who are listening a little bit more about your work and the kind of work what the countries you've been in, what the kind of work you've been doing. And is it research or is it also working to create strategies for some of the communities you're in?
Sure. So, I mean, the work that we do is both research and action oriented. Over the past 2 decades, myself and my team have worked in conflict settings and in settings of displacement in Kenya, in Uganda, in Lebanon, in South Africa, and also in settings of acute conflict like Democratic Republic of Congo and Afghanistan, and really trying to work in schools with teachers and young people to think about the ways in which education can play a role in adapting, in thriving, in understanding roots of conflict that can really promote a different kind of future in overcoming conflict and working on those kind of root causes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would love to hear more about the strategies you're thinking about, but let me turn to Ana with a
Great.
question for her about sort of zooming in on, in your school and in the work that you do with schools. What are the strategies? What are the ways, conversations you're having about how to adapt to this very uncertain, tumultuous time? And are there things that are giving you hope that are seem very positive right now?
Well, thank you so much, Rick. It's wonderful to be here with you and Sarah. And when I think about this time that we're experiencing around the remote learning opportunities, I really see the ways in which communities have come together to really adapt this interesting new formula of experiencing schooling. And in a way that actually allows us to have a much more intimate interaction with students and families, because we're literally now inside their homes. And this has given us an opportunity to really see students. We always talk about teaching the whole child and being present and bringing in all of who they are into a school building when it's brick and mortar. But now this opportunity of turning it around and being a part of their lives within their actual worlds and how their worlds are actually constructed has been incredibly eye-opening and has provided an opportunity to really think about how we think we know how to access or how to provide ways for them to learn, and really allowing them to be more of a guide to that learning in a very different way than it would have been. It almost feels like we went from one dimensional, being the ones that were receiving students, now to this three-dimensional world where we've turned it around and we're in their spaces and they're in our spaces, and our understanding of each other and what our strengths and areas of growth are, both as teacher and student, have become in this new reality.
Yeah. You know, I mean, this is fascinating. It's super interesting. But when you talk about entering into students' homes in a new way, what does that look like? And does it mean more contact with students, more contact with parents? Is it gathering more information from them?
Oh my gosh. Well, as any parent who might be listening, this signing up to be a teacher and homeschooling, when that was definitely not necessarily a choice for many of our families or the caregivers that the children have, whether it be a grandparent, an auntie, even an older sibling. This idea of who is the teacher has completely expanded and become much more of a family approach. And when I say family, that includes the teacher that comes from the school setting and becoming a real member of that family in a real tangible way. And, you know, we give a lot of lip service around how we are partners with families. This situation now really forces that partnership to be one that is much more, I keep saying expandable, but it is expandable. We rely on the co-teacher to be that member in the family, especially for our younger students. You know, we have children as young as 3, 4, 5. They're not necessarily connecting on Zoom or going on the Google Classroom on their own. They're really relying on the different members of their families to really navigate these platforms with them. So inadvertently, these folks become a co-teacher to the teacher from the school. So it's been a really interesting way to partner with one another.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds terrific. Sarah, do you have thoughts about this and thoughts from your work about concrete things that you see people doing that are?
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea, Anna, that you raise about this kind of expandability of who the teachers are.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is just how much we as parents and caregivers have already become more nimble and adaptable as we watch our children and see what they need in different moments and figure out what works amid all sorts of competing priorities. But of course, this process is also stressful and really untenable for different families in different ways, depending on illnesses in families, the kinds of work that families do, the loss of jobs, access to resources, and the different kinds of needs that children have. I think one of our learnings from conflict settings that's really relevant here is that both family and community resources become essential, like you're saying, Anna, in this kind of times of crisis. So we see the importance of standardized, large scale kind of approaches to meeting basic needs, to redistributing resources like food and assistance with shelter, and ensuring that everyone is included. Yet in our work with Somali refugees in Kenya or Syrians in Lebanon, Congolese refugees in Uganda, we also see the ways in which teachers and families who are able to make local decisions and adapt their approaches to teaching and learning to meet the needs of the individual students and the context in which they're living are really often able to more deeply engage with students, and to sustain that kind of learning and to adapt it to the ways in which kids can really thrive in uncertainty.
I really appreciate the use of the word nimble. Like that's definitely something, and adaptable. That's definitely something that we have taken on as a charge, both on the educator side and on the request and in the ways families have adapted. And when I think about all of the places that you mentioned and the places where you work, Sarah, um, just a reminder to folks that are listening, many of the children that are coming into the schools are coming from these places that had conflict. So
Mhm.
many of our students are reflective of the families and the places that you've worked in, Sarah. So it's like an incredible bridge in our work that we see many of these students arriving at the shores of the Boston Public Schools,
Mhm.
and it's been really interesting to see how the thinking around what does it mean to have a school day has had to mold itself around the needs of families in a way that we would have never been able to adapt at the school setting. So at the school setting, the bell rings at 8:10, ends at 2:30. Where now in this world, the opportunities that we see are the ability for teachers, because they too are adapting to a new way of working, and also having to do what we're all doing by staying at home with their families. Many of the teachers are also dealing with their own family, while they're also trying to support their students. So it's a lot of different layers of how to adapt to this world that include the educator as well. And because of that, our typical school day has had to be beyond the norm of the bell to bell. Sometimes teachers are on one-on-one tutorials with students at 8, 9 o'clock at night, because that's when they're able to come on with their teacher, and the teacher is also able to really be there more for the students. So this idea of when the school time begins and ends has had to have some fluidity as well, which also allows insight into different ways in which families function. So it's that part of it is the nimble part. That made me think of that as well.
Yeah. Anna, I'm just wondering, my guess is that what you're describing, which is exciting, varies though, in the sense that some teachers are able to do this very effectively. Other teachers, I imagine, are more resistant to doing it. I mean, you're really talking about a big shift in the way folks work with parents and with families. Are you finding that variation? And what are you seeing out there in terms of this? Yeah.
Well, I think the thing that we have to remember is even before this new normal that we are experiencing right now, the ways in which resistance to new forms or new methodology or new ways of thinking about teaching, that resistance was always a tension within schools. And now in this having to adapt even to learning how to really maneuver and to manipulate Zooming, something that some of us had some experience with, some of us did not. So even having teachers themselves adapting to the new platforms has been a learning curve for many. And I would say like phase one, and we consider this part of what are we in week 6 or 7, entering phase 2, where in the beginning it was more about what Sarah was mentioning, about really thinking about the basic needs of students and families, and now moving into that sustainability and really the places around learning that can be enriching. And Rick, to your point, that in between of these two forms of learning definitely have some tensions and some challenges, because the educators themselves have hit challenges. We have staff members who've lost family. We have families who are sick. We have teachers who've been sick. So all of these things are being navigated by all of us in a real way, where I find even when you think about families and children being at different places on the continuum of being able to receive or give, we're all still experiencing some of these things in a similar way too. So there are differences, but then there are also these really interesting similarities that sometimes are really difficult similarities.
Yeah, thank you. So Sarah, I want to shift gears a little bit, not a lot. And Anna, I'd love to pull you into this conversation too, but it's about an inequity. And, you know, there have been unconscionable inequities, frankly, in this country for centuries, I mean, for decades. So this is not new, but this has in many ways exacerbated the inequities. You know, communities of color, low-income communities have been disproportionately hit by this. And it's also made access much more difficult for a variety of reasons to educational resources. And I'm wondering how you think about, how do we engage students? How do we engage young people and their families in a conversation about this? I mean, what is it? And how do we mobilize them in response to this?
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of our global work. So now almost all of the 2 billion children globally will have had some experience of school closure and disruption. And I think, Anna, this speaks to what you were talking about of how can we kind of build on now a shared experience of challenge and difficulty, even if all of us experience it in very different ways, to think about the ways that this really shines a magnifying glass on the kinds of inequities that exist within our education systems. And I think one of the real ways in which in conflict affected countries, systems try to kind of rethink and reimagine what equity focused education looks like, it's often described as kind of building back better. But I think useful to think about these ways in which we do have an opportunity not to anticipate a return to normal, but instead to really reimagine. One around, just like you and I were talking about, Anna, the ways in which families and communities are creating teaching and learning for young people, often in very different ways than systems do. And sometimes it takes a crisis to bring that to the public, and really to ways of thinking about how community-centered ideas of education could be worked into formal schooling. So we think about the kind of learning that we value rather than just the kind of schooling, so that all kids could see themselves, their histories, their families welcomed and represented in schools in that way. And I think the other big element that we see in conflict settings is that in order for kids to feel like they can thrive in uncertainty, that they need some tools to understand the kinds of inequalities around them and what has driven the uncertainty. And in a conflict setting, often that's the violence around them or the way in which power is used. And obviously we see these issues within the US too. So I think a question to ask ourselves is, how can we help young people to better learn to identify and analyze and act on inequalities, not as tangential to their everyday educational experiences, but really as core to that process.
Sarah, you made me think of how some of us have been saying, how can we use this crisis to actually open up opportunities and not waste this opportunity? And thinking about what you just mentioned, Rick, around how a lot of these systems of inequities have existed for a long time, and how can we take this as an opportunity to flip some of them on its head? Like even this idea of schooling, like you said, Sarah, we no longer have to be confined to the four walls. And, like in any system, we have schools or teachers whose practice is exemplar, and we have schools and teachers whose practice is not. And then how do you give access to children who would not have had access to that exemplar teacher because they were stuck in school A? They're able to actually open up the opportunity to have more students access the higher quality school or the higher quality teacher, because of the ways in which we're even having this conversation now, that we can, by a flip of a switch, be accessible to one another globally and across our communities in ways that we would have never been able to do before. And not that we didn't have access to these technologies before, but we sure as heck weren't pushed to use them in this way before. And I really appreciate the way you were saying, Sarah, that it's in places of conflict, like thinking about how to really bring communities together in different ways. It's almost the silver lining of the crisis is to rebuild. And I know you said it in a very different way, but that rebuilding piece that you mentioned, how do we rebuild schools so that equity is at the forefront? And then how do we create those opportunities for equity in this new way of thinking about schooling?
Very well put. Sarah, do you want to respond to that, or?
I think, I mean, one of the ways that we see, I think in conflict settings and Ana, you may have more examples of this, but that we see now, and I think this speaks to your point too, Rick, about teachers kind of learning new ways, is that teachers and families are the first responders in those ways too. So the children are in front of us and we're thinking about, well, what do they need? What's of value to us that kids learn? And so teachers finding new ways, whether they are in Ethiopia or in Boston, reaching their students in ways that the students know how to access.
Mm-hmm.
So that sometimes those are not the kind of system level responses, but one child needs a phone call and one child needs a packet dropped off at their door and another child needs a handwritten letter that kind of shows up and another needs a WhatsApp video so that the teacher can really see if they've received it or not. And it allows us also to see just this very individualized caring work that teachers and families are always doing, but made more visible, ironically, when we are isolated in our homes.
And that differentiated way of approaching the learning, right, that you were mentioning, Sarah, whether it's a video, it's a call, it's a one-on-one session on Zoom. There's so many different ways in which teachers have taken this idea of really adapting the teaching to the needs of the particular child. But I also, I'm thinking about the ways in which this opens up possibilities, but there are also challenges to this as well. I think access to something as basic as the internet has been something that's been really a challenge across different parts of our city that many Bostonians may not even know, because the assumption is we live in Boston. We're not Ethiopia and Uganda. Of course we have access to the internet. That's a basic, but that's actually not a basic that every single family in Boston has. So we've been really working really hard with different companies. Even the idea of a school district and who we work with, Comcast has become the buddy of BPS because we're trying to find new ways of accessing the internet for families who do not have access to those things. And that's been a really interesting way in which we've had to expand the way we think about the way we outreach to families too.
And to me, that seems like it's so core to this kind of differentiation too, so that we think about what these different needs are, whether that is in rural or urban areas or within an urban area, from house to house, and how as teachers and educators, we can try to know our students well enough to know what they need in those ways and develop both the system level responses and the individualized approaches.
And Sarah, you made me think of something else that, and Rick, you had asked me that earlier about what has been learned by going into families' homes. And I would say what you reminded me of, Sarah, is also the vulnerability of students that sometimes don't show up when they come to school. You have a student in front of you and you have no idea of the food and home insecurity, or that their family arrived from Haiti only a few months ago, and with the crisis and unfortunately the impact of COVID has actually impacted many members of their family, and you wouldn't even know until you actually were teaching a lesson, and in that moment that child is revealing so much more because they're in a space at home where they're comfortable and everything opens up to the teacher. And those things have happened more often than I can count, and much faster, I would venture to guess right now, than it would have happened had it been the traditional setting of going into school versus the teacher going into their home.
That makes a lot of sense. You know, we have a bunch of questions, so I'm
Oh
gonna
my gosh.
turn to the questions now. And the first question is about student motivation. Students are becoming less motivated, some questioners say. They find it difficult to find a purpose on what they are doing. How can we help them? So how can we help mobilize student motivation during this time?
Oh my gosh. Sarah, do you want I'm happy to start if you want to start.
I think just kind of one big takeaway from conflict settings is this like shift of mindset between the kind of pivoting that we're needing to do as being temporary to it being a long-term learning how to live with uncertainty. And so this sense of kind of developing motivation around what the future can bring and those opportunities that might be there, while of course recognizing all of the challenges. But instead of setting ourselves up for the disappointment that we're not going to return to school tomorrow and see our friends, of really finding new ways so that we can find new ways to be motivated in that work. Anna, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I would say that one thing that we've learned most recently, especially with middle school students and high school students in particular, is that this idea of let me lure you into this learning platform by making my lesson really jazzy and really being a teacher that's going to have the whistles and lights and therefore I'm going to capture you, that really is not working. That back to what Sarah said about building community and this idea of the peer-to-peer, that I would, if I were a betting woman, I would say that that person that asked that question, somewhere in adolescence is where the motivation, we're seeing it really crash and burn at this point with students. They're missing their peers so much. And we know from our work and developmentally that that's a necessity for teenagers and for kids in middle school and high school. And that we're having to think about ways in which they do a lot more meaningful interactions with one another within this platform, where the teacher also allows them to do some of that work with each other and almost not get out of the way, but provide a space where the students don't feel like the teacher's in the middle, but rather that they're able to also conduct what happens during that time. And what is the need of connection? Because they're very isolated, like literally isolated in their homes. And how can we use this opportunity to have them really reconnect with one another in a different way?
Yeah. No, and the research on motivation really does suggest that when students feel connected to teachers, when they feel like teachers are invested in them and stretching for them, they're more likely to be motivated, they're more likely to be engaged. So absolutely. Moving on to another question. What are some of the ways to help students deal with loss during this time? Family loss, loss of routines, milestones, different kind of loss. One of you mentioned this, loss of contact with friends.
I would say that this is happening on a daily basis at this point with many children and their families across our city, and acknowledging and being very open to having these conversations and not shying away from what does it mean to have trauma sensitive response to students. And, many of our schools already have connections to social workers and school counselors, and really tapping into this idea of surrounding a student or surrounding a child from many of the ways in which services can come to them and with them, and also including the families in that work, that it's no longer about having conversations with the child in isolation, but really it's about approaching it from a family perspective and from a village perspective, where the thing that I've noticed in schools that has happened with this crisis is that the schools have become their own micro villages, and they really have stepped up to support one another. And that's something that has to be supported and fostered within school communities. Because right now to have to pour out my heart to a stranger that I'm connected to because they happen to have a title of counselor, that's not what we see as working with our students. What's really working with our students is that connection that they have with the adult. Back to your point, Rick, knowing an adult and a teacher or someone in the school community that's connected to them, and and really surrounding them with that type of care, but also not being silent about what they're going through.
Yeah. Sarah, you want to add here?
I mean, I think that this just also speaks to the kind of relationships of belonging that we find even in stable situations really enable kids to be motivated and to learn more. And so how do we think about where those relationships are located? When we ask refugee young people where their relationships of support are, they're often not, to your point, Ana, in the people with the title of those who are supposed to provide trauma counseling. They are the peers, the older siblings, the cousin who moved 3,000 miles away but is still connected in those relationships of support. So opening those lines of communication to figure out what that constellation of supports really looks like for any one young person embedded in the relationships of care that schools are so central to providing.
And the only thing I would add is that in the school communities where they utilize restorative justice circles, those schools have created these structures where these conversations become an organic part of the way that we build community. And in those places where communities are being built in that way, the response to loss and trauma is part of how they do their business, how they do schooling. And we find that they're better prepared to adapt and to also respond to the needs of students.
You know, I think we are running out of time. I think we can squeeze in one more question. It's an important one, and a number of people have asked about this. It's about caring for the caretakers. I mean, it's about caring for teachers, and both of you have talked about what a crazy stressful time this is for teachers, but also caring for parents during this time. And I don't know, either one of you want to share thoughts about this one?
Oh my gosh. Well, this is the forever work, no? The caring for caretakers. And I would say probably school people and those of us who are in the front lines supporting families are maybe some of the worst people to ask this question to, Rick. But I will say that, you know, those collegial bonds and the recognition of I see you and I see that you're experiencing that same thing as a colleague and an educator, and creating those spaces where we're able to really think through together, you know, how and where we're also struggling, because the impact isn't just one-sided. Like I mentioned before, the impact is really for all of us. The teachers and everyone else are also having to deal with either the same impact on illness or having to homeschool their own children while they're also trying to be professionals in teaching other people's children. So that recognition with colleagues, but also with the families too, that there is this opportunity for this camaraderie around it that I would say is unprecedented. I understand what you're going through because I'm going through the same thing, and that has really deepened the connections across teacher, families, and even colleague to colleague.
So I think it's time I think we have to wind up, and it's time for takeaways. Sarah, I know that you had some takeaways that I'm very eager to hear, and I think they're going to be displayed in 1 second.
I can get started on those, even if they're not kind of displayed. But I think, I mean, really based on this conversation, Ana, that you and I have had, I think there's this important recognition that that as caregivers, as parents, as teachers, as educators, that helping students to understand that a swift return to what was normal before is not possible, and also likely not desired, that our real role is to help young people acquire the kinds of skills and tools to thrive amid uncertainty, and establishing new norms and sets of predictability that can work towards that are key. Part of that is that we know that times of crises really tend to exacerbate existing inequities, and that young people need to be able to grapple with what those inequities are, the root causes of the disparities that they experience, and understand their peers and communities to be experiencing, and develop strategies to really work on these inequalities that have been exacerbated while being long existing. And I think this last point that we really ended up on is this idea of how important long-term and sustained relationships among teachers, families, young people, communities are to really creating a sense of belonging and collective responsibility for each other. And that these relationships of care may not happen in ways that we're used to, but we may have new opportunities to build them even stronger so that we can work together towards a long-term sense of being able to support each other and care for each other in challenging times and to navigate them together.
Ana, any takeaways you want to leave folks with?
Oh my goodness, I am very excited about this possibility of schools with no walls, and how exciting it will be to see the future of our students experiencing that.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, I want to thank you both so much. We also have this routine of giving high fives to each other and locking elbows. So I hope we can lock elbows and give high fives. And a high five and an elbow lock to everybody in the audience too. Thank you so much for joining us. I also wanted to tell you that you can we'll keep taking your questions on Facebook. Stay in touch and check out hgse.me.ednow.me/ednow to rewatch this and find out about future episodes. And the next episode, we're going to be talking about the future of education. We're going to have some wonderful speakers in the next episode. I'm very excited about it. And then we're going to take a break. We're going to take a hiatus for a little while, and then we will be back. But thank you again so much to Sarah and Ana. We are thrilled to have you. Be well and take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ana. Thanks, Rick.
Bye-bye.
Well, bye-bye.
Thank you.